He made America laugh for 30 years. Every single night, millions of people settled into their couches, reached for the remote, and without even thinking about it, trusted him. They trusted his smile, they trusted his timing. That easy, quiet confidence he carried the moment he walked out from behind that curtain. Johnny Carson wasn't simply a television host. He was something rarer than that. He was a ritual, a comfort, the last familiar voice people heard before the day finally let them go. But behind that desk, behind those perfectly pressed suits and that disarming, almost effortless grin, something else was living, something quieter. Something that Carson himself guarded with a discipline most people never even noticed, because the performance covering it was so complete, so polished, so convincing. For decades, the people who stood closest to him tried to find the right words. They reached and they came up short. He was complicated, they said. He was private. There were rooms inside him, they told anyone who asked, that simply stayed locked. No key offered, no invitation extended, ever. Most people accepted that and moved on. The public loved what they could see, and they never thought to wonder about the rest. But 32 years after his final curtain call, and more than 2 decades since the world lost him entirely, something is quietly beginning to surface. Not through scandal. Not through tabloid noise or sensational accusations. Through something far more unsettling than any of that, through the careful testimony of people who were actually there. Through letters that sat untouched. Through a portrait of a man that, when you finally look at it clearly, looks almost nothing like the one the world spent 30 years adoring. The question was never simply what Johnny Carson was hiding. The deeper question, the one that lingers long after everything else fades, is why after all this time it still matters so much. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes with being universally loved. It sounds like a contradiction. It almost sounds ungrateful. But for Johnny Carson, who stood at the absolute center of American culture for 3 decades, that loneliness was as real as anything else he ever experienced. More real, perhaps, than most things. He was born in Corning, Iowa in 1925. A small town. A quiet childhood by most accounts, though quiet in Carson's case always carried a certain weight beneath it. His mother, Ruth, was a woman described by those who knew the family as emotionally distant. Not cruel, not absent in any visible way. But cold in the way that certain Midwestern households could be cold, where love was understood to exist but was rarely spoken aloud. Where approval always seemed to hover just slightly out of reach, no matter how hard you stretched toward it. Carson himself almost never spoke about his mother in public. When he did, the words came out careful, measured. The kind of language a man uses when he has thought very long and very hard about what he is, and is not willing to give away. What biographers and the people genuinely close to him have quietly suggested over the years is that this early hunger, this childhood spent reaching for a warmth that never quite arrived on its own, followed Carson forward. Into every room, into every relationship, into every version of his life, no matter how far he traveled from that Iowa town, he discovered magic as a boy, literally. He ordered a kit from a catalog, taught himself the tricks alone. And by his early teens, he was performing at local gatherings under the name The Great Carsoni. There was something quietly telling in that even then. A boy who learned, early and deliberately, that if you controlled what people saw, you controlled what they felt. You controlled the moment entirely. By the time he reached adulthood, that instinct had grown into something extraordinary. Radio, military service, small television markets, each step measured, each move intentional. Each one bringing him closer to a stage that would eventually become the most influential platform in the history of American entertainment. The Tonight Show began its Carson era in 1962. And from very nearly the first broadcast, something became clear to anyone watching carefully. This man did not simply perform for the camera. He existed within it, comfortably, completely. With a control so total it barely looked like control at all. America fell in love almost overnight. But the writers who worked with him, the producers, the musicians, the guests who sat across that famous desk, many of them walked away from those years carrying a feeling they struggled to explain. Admiration, yes, always that, but alongside it something quieter and harder to name. The sense of having spent years standing close to someone and somehow never quite reaching them. For a long time that feeling stayed private. Now slowly and carefully it is beginning to come forward. To understand what is now emerging about Johnny Carson, you have to first understand the architecture of the life he constructed around himself. Because it was, in every meaningful sense, an architecture, deliberate, precise, built to hold. He was, by virtually every account, a man of extraordinary control. Not in any sinister sense, not in the way the word might first suggest, but in the way that certain deeply private people learn over years to manage the space around them so carefully that nothing unexpected can break through the surface. Nothing uninvited. Nothing they didn't choose. The Tonight Show was a machine of the highest order, and Carson ran it with a precision that could border on obsession. He knew exactly how long a guest segment needed to breathe. He knew instinctively when to lean forward, when to pause, when to let a silence do what no word could. He knew which jokes would land and which ones to quietly pull before they ever reached air. His writing staff, among the most talented people working in television at the time, described the experience of working for him as something between reverence and exhaustion. He was fair. He was sharp, he expected excellence and received it. But warmth, openness, those he kept behind a different curtain entirely. Ed McMahon, his longtime announcer. The man many considered his closest professional companion through all those years, once reflected on their friendship with a kind of quiet honesty that said considerably more than he probably intended. He spoke about how much he genuinely admired Carson, how much he cared for him in the truest sense, and then, almost gently, he said something that stayed with people. He said that even after everything they had shared, all those years, all those nights, all those moments, he was never entirely certain that Carson had truly let him in. Not completely. Not all the way. That feeling, it turned out, was not unique to Ed McMahon. His 4 marriages each ended in varying degrees of pain and public attention. The divorces were messy at times, expensive, emotionally charged in ways that occasionally spilled into the open. His first wife, Jody, had married him before the fame arrived, back when he was simply a young man with ambition and a magic kit, and an instinct for performance. By the time the fame came, something between them had already shifted in ways that neither could quite put into words. What followed the subsequent marriages, the familiar pattern that observers began to notice, was a cycle of initial warmth, quiet withdrawal, and then a silence that somehow grew louder than any argument ever could. Journalists who covered Carson tended to treat the marriages as the story, the alimony figures, the courtroom details. The self-deprecating jokes he made on air about his own failed relationships, turning his private wounds into public punchlines before anyone else could get there first. But the people who looked more carefully at the pattern began to see those marriages differently, not as the story, but as a symptom of one. Evidence of something older and far more deeply rooted, a man who could perform intimacy with breathtaking, heartbreaking skill, and yet struggle profoundly to sustain the real thing in any private room where the cameras weren't rolling. The distance, when you study it long enough, was never accidental. Carson had built it carefully and consistently over years, until it had become so much a part of him that he may no longer have experienced it as a choice. It had simply become the only way he knew how to move through the world. In 1991, Carson's son Richard was killed in a car accident in California. He was 39 years old. Carson was 65 at the time. He had roughly 1 year remaining on The Tonight Show. His final episode would air the following May, and then, almost immediately, he would vanish from public life with a completeness that left the entire industry quietly stunned. The timing has always been noted. But what has received far less attention over the years is what the relationship between Carson and his 3 sons, Chris, Corey, and Richard, had actually looked like from inside it. What it felt like to be his child. According to accounts that have emerged carefully and gradually over time, that relationship carried the same complicated weight as every other close relationship in Carson's life. He provided for his sons. He was not, by any report, a cruel or indifferent father in the most fundamental sense, but he was absent in ways that went beyond what any busy schedule could explain. He was emotionally remote in ways his sons clearly felt, though they spoke about it rarely and always with great care, the way children of famous people learn to speak. Aware always that whatever they say will be studied and amplified and turned into something larger than they intended. Richard, by several accounts, struggled more openly than his brothers. There were difficulties that people close to the family understood, but that almost never made their way into any public conversation during Carson's lifetime. Richard carried his own complicated relationship with his father's shadow, the particular suffocating pressure of growing up as the child of someone the entire country felt it owned. When Richard died, Carson grieved in the only way he seemed truly capable of grieving, inwardly, silently, in a way that left almost no visible mark on the surface. People who were close to him during that time described a man who grew even more sealed after the loss. Not shattered in the dramatic way grief sometimes breaks people open, just further away. Like a light that had already been slowly dimming for years, going a little darker and then a little darker still. What has begun to carefully surface now through personal correspondence, through interviews given by people in Carson's closest circle, is the suggestion that he carried a very specific guilt about his son. Not guilt in any legal or external sense, but the quiet, private, grinding guilt of a parent who reaches a moment of terrible clarity and wonders whether the distance they maintained, the distance they chose, again and again, had a cost they couldn't bring themselves to calculate until it was far too late to change anything. That question whether Carson carried, somewhere in the deepest part of himself, the belief that he had failed the people he loved most, is one of the threads running through everything that is now being slowly, carefully reassembled about his life. When Carson walked off the Tonight Show set for the last time on May 22, 1992, he did something that almost nobody who knew him expected. He simply disappeared. Not in the way that retired celebrities so often disappear, still circling the edges of their former world, still appearing at the right events, still conducting occasional interviews, still performing the careful maintenance of a public existence. Carson withdrew completely. He moved to a quiet home in Malibu. The television appearances stopped. The interviews were declined, consistently and without exception, until the refusals themselves became a kind of legend in entertainment journalism. He sent jokes to David Letterman occasionally, privately, quietly, with a warmth that felt genuine precisely because it was never public. But he did not surface. He did not write the memoir everyone expected. He did not revisit the stage. For a man who had spent his entire adult life standing in the brightest possible light, the silence was something people genuinely didn't know how to process. Some read it as peace. As a man finally untethered from the machine he had operated for 30 years, choosing for the very first time to simply exist without performing. And maybe in part that was true. But the people who maintained any real contact with Carson during those Malibu years described something more complicated beneath the quiet. A restlessness that never fully settled. A sense, which some of them felt more than they could clearly articulate, that the work itself had always been serving a purpose beyond entertainment. That the nightly ritual of going out there, making people laugh, managing every moment with total precision, it had been keeping something at bay. Something that, without the work to hold it back, had more room than it had ever had before to simply sit with him. He spent those years largely alone. His fourth wife, Alexis, had divorced him in 1983. He never remarried. There was companionship in his later years by all accounts, but the emotional structure of his solitude remained fundamentally what it had always been. Quiet, closed, entirely his own. He developed emphysema, a consequence of decades of smoking, a habit he had always kept carefully off camera, away from the lights and the public image. He said nothing about his health publicly. He invited no sympathy. He simply grew quieter, and the world, which had once hung on his every well-timed pause, largely honored the line he had drawn. He died on January 23, 2005. And it was only then, in the careful, private space that followed, that certain people began to speak. Carson was, by the accounts of everyone who ever received one, a remarkable writer of letters. This surprises people when they first hear it, because the Carson the world knew was a performer, a reactor, a live wire, a man whose genius lived in the spontaneous spark of real-time conversation. Letters work entirely differently. They are slower, more considered, and in ways that conversation never quite forces, more honest. In the years since his death, some of those letters have been quietly, partially referenced by the people who received them, not published, not sold. Not used to build any kind of story at someone else's expense, but mentioned, reflected upon, shared in fragments by people still trying to understand a man they believed they knew. What those fragments suggest is something that takes a moment to fully absorb. The private Carson, the one who wrote those letters, was almost startlingly different from the one who sat behind that desk every night. Not a different person exactly, but a different frequency entirely. In his letters, according to those who have spoken about them, he wrote with a self-awareness the camera never once captured. He wrote about loneliness plainly, without dressing it in humor. He wrote about regret, about specific choices, specific people, specific moments of damage, in language that was direct and unguarded in a way his public self almost never permitted. One former colleague, reflecting in a documentary interview, described receiving a letter from Carson years after they had stopped working together. The colleague had expected something brief, if anything at all, a polite note, a professional courtesy. What arrived instead was something far more unexpected. A letter that acknowledged a specific moment of unkindness on Carson's part, offered a genuine and unambiguous apology, and then went further. Reflected, honestly and painfully, on the kind of man Carson was afraid he had been through much of his life. The colleague said they sat with that letter for a very long time. Because the man in those pages, honest with himself, willing to reach across years to acknowledge a wound he had caused, was not the man most of America believed it knew. And yet he was unmistakably real, unmistakably Carson. The voice was his, the precision of the language was his, the self-awareness was his. That tension is at the heart of everything now slowly emerging. Not a scandal, not a crime, not a single revelation dramatic enough to build a headline around. Something quieter than all of that, and in many ways far more devastating. The portrait of a man who understood himself in private with extraordinary clarity. Who saw exactly what he was and what he had sacrificed. And who spent decades performing a version of warmth and ease and effortless connection that may have cost him every genuinely warm, easy, truly connected thing in his actual life. The hardest part of looking clearly at someone we have loved is the moment when admiration and grief begin to occupy the same space at the same time. When you can hold both without collapsing one to make room for the other. Carson's place in the history of entertainment is not in question. What he built across 30 years, the format, the rhythm, the culture of late-night television, stands as one of the most significant and lasting achievements the medium has ever produced. Every host who came after him, every person who eventually inherited that particular chair, carries something of what he created. Some acknowledge it openly and gratefully. All of them live inside it, whether they fully realize it or not. But greatness at that scale is never truly without a cost. And in Carson's case, according to those who witnessed it most closely, that cost appears to have been carried primarily by the people who loved him. His sons, living their adult lives in the long, complicated shadow of a man the entire country felt it had a claim on. His former wives, each holding fragments of a story that was never entirely theirs to share publicly. His professional colleagues, people who admired him with genuine depth, who walked away from years of working, alongside him with the persistent, quiet ache of never having truly been let in. And even the audience itself, those millions of people who trusted him every single night, who were, in a very real sense, the recipients of a performance so extraordinarily sustained that it required Carson to withhold the very parts of himself that might have made the whole thing genuinely real. Questions have been raised carefully and without firm conclusions by those who have examined his estate and the decisions made surrounding it. Whether certain late career choices and certain arrangements left behind reflected a pattern deeper than professional preference, a need for control that didn't stop at the edge of his own life. An attempt, even in death, to determine precisely what would be visible and what would remain protected. No official conclusion has been reached on those questions. The estate has been handled quietly. Certain documents remain private by deliberate design. But the picture assembling itself now slowly, piece by piece, through the careful accounts of people who were genuinely there, is of a man who understood with complete clarity the profound danger of being truly known. Who built everything around him, the image, the silences, the distances, the locked rooms, to prevent exactly that. Who gave the world for 30 years everything he had to give. Everything, that is, except himself. There is something in the story of Johnny Carson that goes far beyond the specifics of his career, or his marriages, or the particular and deliberate shape of his silence. Something that reaches further than any single detail and lands somewhere more personal than most stories are willing to go. Most of us will never stand in front of millions of people. Most of us will never have to manage an image at that scale or sustain a performance under that kind of scrutiny for that length of time. And yet, the core of what Carson lived with is not unfamiliar to us: the fear of being truly seen by someone who matters. The deeply learned behavior of offering warmth without ever fully surrendering the place inside where vulnerability lives. The gap, sometimes narrow, sometimes vast, between the person we are in public and the person sitting alone with their own thoughts at the end of the night. Carson grew up reaching for a warmth that came in limited supply. He built a career, one of the greatest careers in the history of his industry, on making strangers feel something he found painfully difficult to offer the people standing closest to him. He became perhaps the most skilled emotional performer of his entire generation, and the skill itself, the very thing that made him extraordinary, was also the wall that kept everything real just slightly out of reach. That is not a comfortable thing to hold. It is far easier to sort people into cleaner categories, the authentic and the false, the generous and the withholding, the good and the complicated. Carson refuses all of those categories. He was deeply gifted and deeply limited, often in the very same moment. He was professionally generous and personally guarded. He made the world laugh night after night for 30 years, and may have spent a significant portion of that time quietly carrying a grief he never found a language for. The letters he wrote, those private, unguarded, entirely honest pages that the television audience never knew existed, suggest that the real man was always present, watching everything, understanding far more than he allowed anyone to see, wishing, in ways he could only express alone, that things might have gone differently in the quiet rooms where no camera ever followed. 32 years after his final broadcast, his story remains unfinished, not because of scandal, not because of secrets in the dramatic, headline-ready sense, but because human beings are never truly finished, because the people who shape us in our earliest years, the cold silences and the withheld approvals and the love that arrived in forms we couldn't quite receive, continue to move through us long after we are gone. Their influence lives in what we leave behind, and in what we couldn't bring ourselves to say while we were still here to say it. Johnny Carson made America feel, every single night, that it was in good and capable hands. Whether he ever managed to feel that way himself, that is a question that may never have a clean answer. And maybe that, more than anything the cameras captured, is the truth that was always worth finding. If this story sat with you, if something in it felt close, or made you think about the quiet distance between who we are and who we show the world, leave that thought in the comments. Those conversations are worth more than most people realize. And if you want more stories told this way, carefully, honestly, without reaching for easy conclusions, stay close. Subscribe and keep watching. There is still so much worth uncovering, and we'll do it together.